All right, so we're on to topic 6.5, economic imperialism from 1750 to 1900. So my essential question for you to answer is identify and explain the examples of economic imperialism. Very straightforward, and so we're going to go through several today in class and in the lecture. So industrialization, improving transportation, the rise of the transnational corporations are all going to really lead to the globalization of trade. And as the need for more raw materials increases, like some of the ones I've talked about in the previous lecture, those raw materials are found in different parts of the world than where they're going to be turned into manufactured goods. So then it becomes very important for the companies and the countries that are tied closely with these industries would end up making sure that that the flow of these products will remain, and they will use different means in which to make sure that happens. So we're going to talk about some examples, but the language of the curriculum is about industrialized states and businesses within these states practice economic imperialism primarily in Asia and Latin America. So we'll talk about a couple examples there. But what is imperialism from the economic imperialism? So we talked about imperialism before as like the political and military domination of a region or peoples. A lot extends to culture, but it also extends to economic. And so typically when you see this as a foreign business, and they have interests in like the area that are so great that their influence becomes much more heavy onto local government officials and how they use their labor forces and then natural resources as well. Economic imperialism, if you can really say it still exists today, absolutely it does. But we're going to talk about some examples of this time period. So we're going to start with China first. And so the example itself is Britain and France and China, but there's a lot of context here that we're going to talk about real briefly. But British essentially had a trade debt to China, as the Chinese had products that the British highly desired, such as silk, porcelain, and tea. The British didn't have the things that the Chinese necessarily wanted. Manufactured goods and textiles were not something the Chinese were generally interested in. So there was always this trade imbalance between the two. And so in order to kind of compensate and be able to get these products, they would buy these products with silver. And as time goes on, the silver begins to kind of dry up, and it's not as circulated as it once was in previous points of history. And so the East India Trading Company is going to start importing opium to China. And then they would pay with silver, which the British would take that silver and turn it into buying porcelain, silk, and teas. And as time goes on, the Chinese become more and more addicted as a society to this drug, this hallucinating drug that is very, very addictive. And it creates a lot of social problems that you would expect. The opioid crisis in China is like, we have our own here, and it's pretty bad. And China was pretty bad too. But as things get worse, the Chinese government and the Qin dynasty is trying to make more laws that would try to prevent the sale of opium inside their country. In 1729, they simply banned it. But even though they had banned it, the flow of opium still continues to happen, and the country continues to get more and more addicted to it. But the Chinese in 1839 are going to make an attempt to blockade the only port that was allowed foreigners to be able to bring products in, like opium. And the blockade would attempt to stop the British from being able to sell opium in their country. Now, the Chinese, their military technology is far behind what the British naval technology was. And so the blockade gets ran over, and the blockade itself is going to be an act of war against the British. And so the first Opium War, which will happen in the course of a couple of years, ends up leading to the British being victorious. They're able to capture the city of Nankin, and they force the Chinese to sign an unfair, unequal treaty known as the Treaty of Nankin, and it requires that the China open its ports to foreigners. And that was it. So that is the first Opium War, but it certainly would not be the last. Now, the first Opium War, neither side was completely satisfied with the terms of the treaty. For the Chinese, they weren't happy about having to lose essentially sovereignty over their own ports. And then the British were not happy that the Chinese never made opium legal. And so and of course that's an oversimplification, but a second Opium War does develop, and much like the first one, it ends up being a victory for the British. But this time, the French are going to join the British in the second Opium War to make sure they get their own sphere of influence within China too. In the Treaty of Tientsin, this is going to end the conflict, but it will allow foreign envoys to be able to stay within China, or the capital of China, which is Beijing. And because they're there, they have an enormous amount of influence over the policymakers and the Chinese government to favor the interests and business interests of the French, the British, and other foreign powers. They also are allowed to open up their ports, or forced to open up their ports to Western powers, to the point that the 90 of their ports were under the control of a foreign power by the end of the Qin dynasty. And then opium was legalized. They allowed the freedom of movement of Christian missionaries both in and around China. And then, of course, Britain, in a sense, acquires Hong Kong, which they will hold as their territory for a good period of time. As time goes on, Japan, France, Germany, Russia, and the United States, all the great industrial powers of this era, have kind of created areas of they call spheres of influence, in which they had exclusive trading rights. But as time persists, in 1901, the U.S. is going to propose a open door policy. Basically, China needs to remain an open door, that any country that wishes to trade with them can be allowed to do that, to avoid conflict between the industrialized powers, but also to make sure that that not one power ends up taking control of China. So it gets carved up into different spheres of influence, and each one of them agreed to protect the right to trade with China. So moving to Latin America, as far as economic imperialism goes, the example that's given by the College Board is the port of Buenos Aires. So Argentina as a whole is going to be an area that is going to develop very nicely because of the British investors. Of all the investments the British make overseas, about 10% of all the money spent would be put into Argentina, building telegraph wires, building railroads, and of course building the seaport, which was designed and paid for by the British to ensure the export of things like meat from Argentina. But of course, Argentina is rich with a lot of natural resources. And so the port itself, having bought and paid for and such, gave the huge amount of economic influence of the British over this Latin American country. And that is, any example and why that kind of links into our curriculum. But beyond that, there's not much to say. It's just another way in which the economic influence and wealth power of the British could then lead to the development of things, huge infrastructure projects like the Port of Buenos Aires, and then having an enormous amount of influence on the economic future of Argentina. So they are going to trade in some commodities. The trade in some commodities was organized in a way that gave merchants and companies based in Europe and the U.S. a distinct economic advantage. So I already talked about opium. The trade on opium gave the British a huge economic advantage over China. Cotton is going to give the British a huge economic advantage over other parts of the world, and cotton in particular. After the American Civil War, before the Civil War, the United States South was the place the British typically would buy their cotton from. However, the Civil War disrupts that trade, and therefore they look for other places to find, and they do so in Egypt with Muhammad Ali already kind of nationalizing the cotton industry, and then, of course, South Asia, India, which at the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, India was the number one manufacturer of textiles in the world. They would grow the cotton, they would manufacture into textiles that would be bought. But as time persists, the British, their own textile industry becomes more important. And so cotton ends up being something that the textile industry of India starts to falter in favor of the British, who will take it over in a worldwide market. So India becomes it shifts its goals to just growing the raw materials rather than the manufactured goods. So that's why this is a good example of that as well. And of course, palm oil is another one. And so the palm oil basically is forcing these areas of West Africa, especially, to grow more palm oil, which would be used for things like soap and for lubrications of machine parts. But because of the demand, it forced that monoculture, the monocropping of the region that left it vulnerable to when droughts happen, and your entire economy is based around the growing of palm oil. That is going to lead to huge economic decline, huge falling prices. Famine is another issue that will hit because they're not growing enough food, because they're using farmland that's available more so for palm oil and palm trees rather than having the more food production and then to store food in times of drought. There was also the use of slave labor on these plantations that continued, even though the British had outlawed slavery as a whole and the slave trade. It did continue to exist in Africa for some time. And local natives were forced to grow palm trees. And if they resisted, they were met with brutal retaliation. The environmental impacts of this, also include the deforestation. They also, lead to slash and burn agriculture, and that, of course, changes the landscape because of the need for more palm oil, which can't be grown in Britain, but it's the British and Americans and other industrialized nations who need this palm oil for a number of products. And then we also lead to copper from Chile, and copper is a important product that is going to be used primarily in electric wiring. But a number of other products as well. And so copper in Chile becomes very important to their economy, even though the country of Chile and the region that is now Chile, when it was controlled by the Spanish, was primarily agricultural based. But when copper becomes more high in demand, they have huge deposits of it. The government is going to make sure that the copper mining industry is well protected and that the flow of copper keeps coming. And so, foreign powers and governments and transnational corporations would make sure that the people who held power in Chile would make sure that there was never a disruption to the copper mining industries and, the need for that raw material. There's also bananas, which I'm not going to play it on the PowerPoint. I'm going to put it onto the Canvas page, but for those who don't have access to the Canvas page and are watching this video, go check out The Dark History of Bananas. Another good example that used to be on the AP World Curriculum, is no longer there specifically, but is definitely a good example of economic imperialism that occurs by a transnational corporation from the United States known as the United Fruit Company, and how that impacts certain Latin American countries as a result of that. So with that being said, the essential question is this. Make sure that you go back and answer it. With that being done, Mr. Henry signing off.